of INHA Center for International Studies K Academic. Today's colloquium is hosted by K Academic Diffusion Research Center and sponsored by the Academy of Korean Studies. Well, INHA CISK Academic has been establishing a platform of re-examining political science and international relations in light of Korean studies. And it has been successfully building networks with scholars of political science and Korean studies around the world, as we see today. And I think today's colloquium is surely demonstrating such endeavors. Well, we are now living in an age defined by ever more tense international power relations and a fracturing of world order. Allies are realigning in a dynamic process of making and unmaking world order. This is not just happening just between states, rather it's a global and multidimensional process entailing varied ideas, clashing interests, institutions, and businesses. Sport, especially sports mega event, is an integral part of the making and unmaking of the world order. And today, we are very fortunate to get to talk about sports mega event and world order change with an implication of Korea case with Professor David Black. And how timely it is. We just had a good game with Italy in FIFA U20.
Okay.
Yeah, lost it, but it was a good game to watch. Professor David Black is teaching at Dalhousie University. He is a former president of International Studies Association, Canada section, and he used to serve as a director of Center for Study of Security and Development at Dalhousie University. Professor Black is a prolific author. The list of his writing really literally runs over pages and pages, so it'll take whole colloquium if I decided to introduce his works. So if I can just do two, he's an author of a book titled Canada and Africa in the New Millennium. And his most recent article, one of most recent articles, includes an article titled The Forthright Political Stance of Sport for Development in Korean Official Development Assistance, which is co-authored by one of our discussant, Professor Dr. Na Jung-gyu. Okay, so if you have questions, you can use either chat box, or if I can manage some time after our talk, we're gonna have Q&A sessions. And now, without further ado, the Zoom screen is yours, David.
Well, Professor Kim, thank you very, very much for that kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here. I want to thank you and the discussants. I want to particularly thank Dong-Kyu for the invitation to be here. Dong-Kyu is, as you know, as you've just said, a collaborator, but also I had the pleasure of being the external examiner on his very excellent doctoral dissertation at the University of Ottawa. And so we've forged a professional and personal relationship since that time. And it's a great pleasure to be here with you. I think we might say that this talk could be subtitled Now for Something Completely Different, because unlike many of the speakers that you've had thus far, I don't consider myself a Korea specialist, but I do consider myself someone who thinks of Korea as a very important country in relation to my own interests in three key ways, one of which is that I have a long-standing interest in the role of so-called middle powers and international relations. Canada was a early exemplar of the idea of middle power, and Korea is now one of the principal exemplars of this idea. And it's very interesting to think about Korea's middle power role in relation to global sport. I also have a longstanding interest in the politics of global development. And again, Korea has become a very important exemplar and player in the politics of international development. And of course, I have this longstanding interest in the politics of sport. And again, Korea is one of the principal users of sport as a force, an instrument of political statecraft, amongst other things. So I'm looking forward to your comments. If you find that there are any points that I'm making that are not as clear as they should be, please don't hesitate to ask me about them. And I'm going to now share my screen so that you can see my presentation. Go. So this particular presentation is derived from an article that I relatively recently published, but I've tried to expand a little bit on that article and then draw out some of the ramifications of the way in which sports mega events intersect with the process of world order change and what that could mean for Korea as an actor in international relations and for Koreans and Korean corporations and Korean citizens as participants in global politics. So my brief outline of what I'm going to talk about, and I'll try to keep an eye on my time here, is that I want to talk a little bit about so-called sports mega events, or SMEs, as sites of multiple narratives, as an important force, as Professor Kim has suggested, in the dynamics of international relations, but often still an understudied and underappreciated one. And then I want to talk very briefly about Korea as a serial user of sports mega events for its international relations purposes. Then I want to talk about the way in which SMEs intersect with world order, and in particular, I want to outline how I think they can be understood as both exemplifying but also contributing to the constitution of the most recent phase of world order, which I and others have characterized as hegemonic neoliberalism. So the way they've contributed to the rise, consolidation, erosion, and now challenge of hegemonic neoliberalism. And then I want to talk about how this has led to a kind of crisis of Olympism and along with world order, to the Olympic movement along with world order, and what this could mean for Korea, some of the dilemmas, some of the questions that it gives rise to for Korean policymakers and practitioners. So, whoops, sorry, I went too far. So, oh, geez. For those of you who are unfamiliar with them, and that's unlikely to be the case in Korea, but sports mega events are defined by Morris Roach as large-scale cultural, including sporting events which have a dramatic character, mass popular appeal, and international significance. Sports mega events have never been more prominent, more celebrated, more controversial, and more widely studied in international affairs than they have been in the last generation or so. I've described them as sites of multiple narratives. I'm taking that language from a very well-known Canadian sports sociologist by the name of Bruce Kidd, who has said that sports mega events are always composed of multiple narratives. And that reflects the many objectives that hosts are attempting to achieve when they participate in or when they seek to host sports mega events. So they have developmental aspirations, both national and urban. They have diplomatic objectives. They're seeking to build their soft power, their power of attraction to the country that is hosting or the city that is hosting. They're used for identity projection and branding, and this is a very important way in which Korea has used sports mega events over the years. And they're also, though, and more controversially, what have been characterized as sites of exception, places where the normal rules of accountability and decision-making are suspended because of the importance of the event, because of the urgency of the event, which opens the door to potential exploitation of relatively marginalized groups in these societies, and also resistance, protest and resistance to the misuse of these events for the already powerful in particular societies. And as far as Korea goes, as I've already suggested, few states have made more consistent, systematic, and arguably successful use of sport mega events than Korea has. And you all know this story, going back to really to the Asian Games of 1986 through the 1988 Seoul Olympic Games, and its tremendous importance in signaling Korea's re-emergence or arrival on the world stage, and so on up to, of course, Pyeongchang and beyond. So these events have cumulatively reinforced Korea's claims to rising global status developmentally, and its claim to be a responsible middle power in international relations. But I guess that the general point is that most of these studies of sports mega events have been what I would describe as host or event centric. That is, they focus on the objectives of the host state or the host city, or they focus on the dynamics of the event itself. And what I want to do today is kind of reverse the lens and talk about what sports mega events mean as part of processes of world society and as part of processes of world order formation, erosion, and change. Now, I need to say something quickly about what I mean, how I understand these processes of world order change. And what I want to say is that I adopt a theoretical viewpoint that is rooted in the ideas of Robert Cox, who is known as a neo-Gramscian scholar. I don't know how many of you will have studied Cox and his ideas, but Cox's point about world orders is that they are relatively hegemonic orders in which there is a coalescence of dominant ideas, institutions, and material forces that creates a relatively high level of stability or acquiescence. But these world orders are never permanent. I call this, named this slide, the permanence of world order change. World order change, even when it feels like it's relatively stable to us, is always in the process of having to be adapted, having to be adjusted to new forces, new challenges, and ultimately to eroding and being replaced by successive orders, and what is often a very dynamic and conflictual process. And that dynamic is exacerbated when there are strong revisionist forces, ideas, institutions, states that are unhappy with the order as it currently exists and want to change it. And we are arguably in one of those moments of world order ferment and transition. One of the ideas that has been floated is the idea that we're in a period of world order interregnum, an in-between space, where again, as Gramsci would say, the old order is dying, but the new order is not yet born. So we're in this very difficult and unsettled moment. But the question becomes, how do we understand what causes these changes to take place? And what I want to argue in the time that I have with you is that sports mega events are an important marker of world order dynamics, tensions, and transitions. And I'm just going to throw out a few conceptual clarifications. This role, it can be both immanent and intentional. That means it can be something that unfolds as a result of the inherent logic of these events, that in the nature of these events, they make and challenge world orders, or it can be intentional. In other words, governments may pursue the right to host these events because they want to challenge the dominant order. They want to articulate and exemplify a different way of ordering world affairs. And I would also say that it's important not to overstate the importance of these events. And so what I want to suggest is that their impact is more contextual than causal. World orders don't change because Beijing hosted the 2022 Winter Olympic Games. But that hosting forms part of the context in which the conditions for change are laid, or the groundwork for change is laid. So when you look at this relationship between sports mega events and world orders, it changes your frame. You move from looking at specific events to looking at clusters of events and long cycles. So the ways in which these events form a kind of narrative arc, they form a story in which we can see these trends over time. And I want to also suggest that two dynamics which are really important in this process are what Lila Galady has called conspicuous consumption. This is something we're all familiar with, but these events are one of the ways in which hosts can demonstrate their prestige by virtue of spending lavishly on spectacular events. That's a signal that they're sending to the world. They're attempting to build their prestige through conspicuous consumption. The other thing that I think is an interesting way of marking these processes is the process of campaigns for sports sanctions or sport boycotts. So who is attempting to mobilize a boycott and why? What ideas are being advanced? What social norms are being enforced or challenged? And it isn't just when these boycotts actually take place, it's the campaigns for them that are part of this order-making process. And we're going to see in the near future another one of these boycott campaigns unfolding around the Paris 2024 Summer Olympics, as especially Western allies seek to promote a boycott of Russian, or to boycott the ability of Russian athletes and Belarusian athletes to participate in the Paris Olympic Games. So just to illustrate this argument and to talk about the order that we've been living through and how SMEs have intersected with it, I'm going to very briefly, I hope, lay out the arc of hegemonic neoliberalism and the way it intersected with sports mega events over the period since 1980, since the Moscow Games in 1980. So essentially, we have arguably three phases to this story that I'm going to tell, this narrative arc that I'm going to present to you. One is the emergence of hegemonic neoliberalism. And what I want to suggest is that a kind of pivotal moment in this emergence was the back-to-back Olympic Games that took place. The other thing I should say is that I'm focusing on the Olympics as an exemplar of this process, right? So the Olympics are they've been described by Susan Brownell as the premier global ritual for expressing global community. So the Olympics are the apex event of sports and mega events and the way in which we can see these patterns most clearly. And so in this case, you had the back-to-back Olympic Games of Moscow in 1980 and Los Angeles in 1984, and they were accompanied by what have been described as tit-for-tat boycotts. So the United States organized a large-scale boycott of the Moscow Olympics in 1980 as a result of Moscow's invasion of Afghanistan. And the East Bloc countries, 14 of them led by the Soviet Union, boycotted the Los Angeles Games in 1984. Now, one thing to keep in mind here is that when these Olympics took place, the Olympic movement was in crisis. The crisis of Olympism that we see today is not the first crisis. There have been a succession of crises over time that have reflected these patterns of world order formation and transition. And in this case, there were two bidders for the Moscow Games in 1980 and one for Los Angeles in 1984. So the movement is in trouble. And that trouble was deepened by the boycott of the Moscow Games because it really diminished both the prestige that the Soviet Union was attempting to gain through hosting these events, and it diminished the value of the Olympic Games as a spectacle, as a social institution. And so when the Los Angeles Games took place in 1984, there was every reason to expect that the crisis would deepen. But in fact, the Los Angeles Games delivered salvation to the Olympic movement by insisting on privatizing and commercializing the games. They accompanied the rise of the United States in terms of its patriotic jingoism under President Ronald Reagan, this so-called Morning in America in 1980. And the fact that the Soviet Union and its major allies weren't there meant that the United States was spectacularly successful in this event, and it created a kind of momentum that transformed the Olympic movement for better and for worse into a fully commercialized and professionalized event. And so this is in many ways the beginning of the neoliberalization of the modern Olympic movement. So that's the first phase, that sort of cluster that I want to talk about. Then we have a period of time in which this order, this hegemonic neoliberal order, is rising, adapting, and consolidating. And this is really through the first decade and a half after, from 1988 through to 2000. And this can be seen through the prism of the Seoul Olympic Games in 1988, the Barcelona Games in 1992, the Atlanta Games in 1996, and the Sydney Games in 2000. And I don't have time to go into great depth about each of these events, but each of them was important in contributing to the narrative of the taken for grantedness, the centrality of hegemonic neoliberal norms. So Korea was really important for a couple of reasons, lots of reasons for Korea, but for world order, really important because for one thing, it was an important step towards the universalization of the Olympic movement. It was one of the first non-Western countries to host. It was also very recently a developing country, and so it suggested that all countries could aspire to host the Olympics, could aspire to benefit from this neoliberal order, and because it happened at the same time as Korea underwent the beginning of its process of democratization, it suggested that all good things go together. If you promote this expansive, commercialized, liberal vision of the economy, it will feed into the prospects for political liberalization, for democratization. So Korea stands out as really important in this process, in launching this process. Barcelona was important because it was the first games since 1972 that had not been affected by a boycott of any kind. It was universal. But more to the point, it symbolized the potential to use Olympic Games for processes of urban regeneration. So the big success story about Barcelona was the way in which it transformed what one scholar has called a Rust Belt Mediterranean city into this tourist mecca, this destination for global conferences. So it suggested and put Barcelona on the map as this symbol of both Spanish and Catalonian nationalism. Atlanta was a step backwards. It was considered to be over-commercialized, tackily over-commercialized, and many people, Juan Antonio Samaranch, the then head of the IOC, famously refused to call it the best ever games, which he always did at every Olympic Games, except for Atlanta. So this was a huge slight to Atlanta. But the point about this is it was an opportunity to make a course correction. The perception from Atlanta was that it had been too much dominated by private sector interests, and that in order to protect the integrity of these games, governments needed to form public-private partnerships, a new institutional form in which governments take the risks associated with these events and ensure the success of these events while private sector interests gain many of the benefits. And then Sydney became an Olympics. It was sort of the apex of this neoliberal moment from an Olympic perspective because it symbolized reconciliation. It was seen to exemplify an emphasis on green growth, green modernization, and it was also an exemplar of making Australia into a site of event-centered development. So using these mega events to promote economic interests. Then things start to go sideways. This is the period of erosion when we have Athens in 2004, and I'm skipping over Beijing in 2008, London in 2012, and then Rio in 2016. And the key point that I want to make here is that in this sequence of events, we see the risks of overreach and the limits of universalization. So Athens and Rio in particular, there was huge enthusiasm for these events before they took place, but afterwards they left behind a legacy of corruption, of economic crisis, and of white elephant venues that could not be sustained and could not be used. And what that showed was that contrary to what people thought after Korea, it wasn't, Olympic hosting was not something that every city could aspire to do successfully. And if you overreached, you could end up in a lot of trouble. You could end up actually setting back your developmental objectives, setting back your identity building objectives. And in a way, the insertion of London in the middle of this sequence reinforced that message because it suggested that only world cities, global cities, could successfully host these events, as London did in 2012. And it contributed to an emerging crisis of Olympism as the Olympics became more and more controversial and less popular to potential hosts. And to give you, just to put this in perspective, the apex of cities bidding to host the Olympic Games in this cycle took place in 2004, when 11 different cities from all over the world bid to host the Olympic Games. And by 2024, there was one bidder again. In 2024 and 2028, they had to distribute the event to Los Angeles and Paris because they were the only two cities bidding. So this is the beginning of the erosion of this process. But there's something else going on that overlaps with this process of erosion of hegemonic neoliberalism, and that's the rise of a counter-hegemonic alternative. That's the rise of illiberal hosts, the rise of conspicuous consumption, growing controversy around these hosts, and defiance. And here we can look at, in a sense, Beijing in 2008. Beijing was a spectacular success, but was also very controversial, as you will recall, in the run-up to it, as the torch relay was beset by protests, Tibetan and other protesters protesting human rights violations in Beijing. There was a question in 2008 as to whether the Olympics would foster the liberalization of China or reinforce its authoritarian tendencies? That was a question that was actually often informed by the comparison with Seoul in 1988. And clearly, Beijing had no intention of using this event to engage in a process of liberalization. It wanted to celebrate its own model of development, its own achievements in development. There was then the 2014 Winter Olympics. I've mainly been talking about the Summer Olympics, but there was the 2014 Sochi Olympics in Russia, which was marked by the most expensive Olympic Games ever, by crony capitalism, by a large-scale doping crisis, and shortly after the Olympics, the invasion of Crimea. And so this was an event that took place with the blessing of the International Olympic Committee and the International Paralympic Committee, but was used in a sense for Russia to demonstrate to the world that it was going to take its own path. And there was growing criticism in this context of international sports organizations and corporations that were complicit in what we have come to describe as sport washing, using these sport events to launder the image of hosts. So this is the beginning of the process of contestation and challenge to the hegemonic neoliberal order. And so just to kind of wrap up this story, I'm realizing that I'm getting close to the end of my time. We have the Beijing 2022 Winter Olympic Games, which became a kind of flashpoint in this contestation over the norms that should dominate international relations. One of the key flashpoints was the contestation over human rights. Human rights has been a continuous source of controversy between, as it were, hegemonic and counter-hegemonic forces in terms of Olympic hosting. There was, as you will recall, a diplomatic boycott by a number of Western governments of the Beijing Olympic Games. Many people disparaged that boycott because it was very symbolic. It was not tangible, and their athletes still participated, and corporate sponsors continued to participate. But the level of interest in terms of viewing audiences diminished sharply in Beijing. So, and it was also the site, as you will recall, of the Xi-Putin summit that preceded the invasion, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. I'm getting ahead of myself. So here we get to the two principal users of the Olympics to challenge the hegemonic neoliberal order have been China and Russia. And they've challenged it in different ways and for different reasons. In Russia, in the aftermath of the invasion of Ukraine, there was a series of sanctions, of sporting sanctions imposed on Russia with a comprehensiveness and a speed that we have never seen since the Second World War. There's never been as rapid a process of isolation as the process of isolation that unfolded afterwards, to some extent because athletes took matters into their own hands. So it was Polish and Swedish football players that refused to participate with Russian football players in FIFA World Cup qualifying that forced FIFA's hand. And we saw this cascade of isolation. But now, even that isolation is being challenged because, well, two things to be said about this. First of all, before that isolation, in many ways, international sports organizations and sports mega events had been active in enabling and celebrating Putin's Russia. And I've got a couple of quotes here. Between the Sochi Winter Olympic Games and the Paralympic Games, Russia invaded Crimea. But there was no mention of that in the way the International Paralympic Association talks about the success of that event. There was no real consequences apart from the symbolic the fact that Russian athletes had to participate as part of the Russian Olympic Committee rather than representatives of the Russian state. They weren't, the large-scale doping crisis didn't lead to meaningful sanctions against Russian athletes. And then in 2018, Russia hosted the FIFA World Cup and was widely lionized for hosting an enormously successful event. FIFA, Vladimir Putin gave Julian Infantino, the head of FIFA, a medal for his friendship to Russia in the run-up to the 2018 games, or 2018 World Cup. So here we see sport actually enabling the rise of these hegemonic challengers in lots of important ways. And so this brings us to the question of what next and the implications for Korea. And so we find ourselves once again with the Olympics in a kind of state of crisis that aligns with the state of global crisis in the current condition of world order. So the future of the Olympic Games is in question. There will be, in the most immediate sense, a major controversy over whether or not athletes from other countries should participate in the Paris Olympics, if Russian athletes and Belarusian athletes are allowed to participate. And much of the controversy is falling out on a West versus the rest kind of axis. So most governments in other parts of the world, including Asia, support participating in the Olympics. Western governments led by the East Bloc, or the former East Bloc, Eastern European countries like Latvia, Poland, Czechoslovakia, are advocating for, and of course Ukraine, are advocating for a boycott of the Paris Games if Russian athletes are allowed to participate. So we see this fracturing of the hegemonic order that existed for the last 30 years or so. We see declining interest in event hosting due to costs, risks, and controversies. And this comes with a threat to commercial sponsorships and to broadcast rights and to, in short, to the revenue generating potential of the Olympic Games and the branding potential of the Olympic Games and of other sports mega events. So this is a moment of crisis for the Olympics that mirrors a moment of uncertainty for world order. And so for Korea, this raises a number of important dilemmas, important questions. I want to start by reminding you of what it seems to me, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, that as I said at the beginning, few countries have made more systematic and effective use of sports mega events to serve their purposes in international relations than Korea has. And these interests have not only been about their own self-interest, about generating soft power, about signaling their developmental achievements, about attracting states to investors and others to Korea. They've also been an enabler of what I call Korea's middle power internationalism, its ability to perform a kind of order-sustaining role in international relations. What these games have done indirectly is they've signaled to the world Korea's capacity to convene and organize large-scale international events, to build bridges across divisions, both in the Korean Peninsula and beyond it, and to engage in diplomatic initiatives that bring people together. And those are the same capacities that have enabled Korea to play an increasingly active role as a middle power in international relations. So what is to be done? How is Korea to adapt to a world in which sports mega events in general and the Olympic Games in particular are becoming sites of contestation and division as both a participant in these events and as a host? How, for example, will Korea respond to a boycott campaign around the Paris 2024 Olympics? How to respond to a global social institution in the form of the Olympic Games that is once again in question. The future of the Olympics is once again in question. And I guess a couple of things to keep in mind here. One is that Korea, like other countries, is probably going to have to get a lot smarter about its sporting diplomacy. It recognizing the importance of sporting events, recognizing the peculiarities of these events, and thinking about how it can and should relate to them as sites of world order contestation. Their salience is going to become increasingly important again. But the other question for Korea, and I guess an idealistic point to end on, is the question of whether Korea has a role to play in reimagining the Olympic Games in general and sports mega events in particular. And here I want to quote a well-known sports sociologist who was one of the major critics of the Brazilian FIFA World Cup and the Rio Olympics, Christopher Gaffney, who asks how can we more effectively contribute to, how can sports mega events more effectively contribute to human solidarity, mutual understanding, and social justice? Can we build a different kind of sport mega event, a different kind of Olympic Games that is leading towards a more egalitarian and just kind of international relations? So I'll stop there. I've talked too long, and I'll look forward to your comments.
Thank you, David. There was a fantastic talk, and I thank you for your insight that runs through the early 1980s to now and way forward, which can come only from a scholar who never stopped researching and concerning about it for a long period of time. Thank you very much. And
Thank you.
Sure. Well, David talk was about how Olympics can play a role in making and consolidating and challenging world order in an imminent or an intentional way. And about this talk, now we are going to have discussions. Dr. Sun Jia-ting first. She is an adjunct assistant professor in the Center for Teacher Education at National Taiwan Sports University. Dr. Sun enjoys to research on the relationship between technology, globalization, and modernity. She's not just a researcher, she's also a sports philosopher, sports practitioner, and a physical education teacher. Now the Zoom screen is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you hear me? First of all, I want to thank you for your wonderful and lively speech because I was a softball national player and coach. So for me, I think these contents are very embodied and your lecture is touching. I would like to share some of what I have thought about so far. So actually my research are mainly focused on sports sociology and also bilingual teaching, which is very totally political. Okay, and also I pay my attention on global medical tourism network and the talent training for international sport affairs. This is very special in Taiwan. I will mention that later. But some of my past research has been on the global framework of gene doping governance, so which is also influenced by international relationships and competition in the global order. So I think compared to professors and analyze from an international perspective, I think about this topic from a more national or Eastern Asian perspective. So first of all, I think on this topic, I would like to recommend a journal that regularly has a special issue on Eastern Asia. I just sent it in our chat box, and you can check it. And they have a series of related research on this topic. They're also looking at SME and world changes from an Eastern Asia perspective and reviewing established Olympic and political events through a timeline. So I think Olympic history is also perspective of world history. Yeah. And while other issues are also mentioned, imperialism, these issue introductions clearly point out the temporal and spatial context of the Olympic Games in the Asia-Pacific region. And they analyze the potential meaning in the context of the social situation of each country at that time. So especially from 2018 to 2022, so 3 Olympic Games were scheduled to take place in Eastern Asia cities, Pyeongchang, Tokyo, and Beijing, we know it. And the staging of these 3 Olympic outside the West is unprecedented. So this development may indicate the decline of Olympic Asians in the Western world, I think. And we can also see this as the rise of Eastern Asia country, which is a perspective of modernity. So which we can also think about the roles the global southern areas plays. The 3 Olympic Games, I think, in East Asia are entangled with and some regional geopolitics, right? So the reconciliation between North and South Korea was one of the main themes at Pyeongchang. And the Japan-South Korea's relationship was all-time low during Tokyo 2020. So with the opening of Beijing 2022, less than 100 days away, the diplomatic tensions between the USA and China show no sign of being adapted. So I think this suggests the tension between Asia and global leadership. Also, as well as the complexities within the Asian region inside, and even various reflection and critical within the host country. For example, the Chinese researchers, they have lots of reflection on Chinese sports hero discourse from government, from media concerning. So I think this also means that the different countries, they have different propositions, strategies, and objectives when they are trying to dealing with SME at the domestic, regional, and international levels. They have different intention. So because the close relationship between Taiwan and Korea, and I want to share some more Taiwanese experience to here. Because Taiwan is a very important player in observing China, right? And I have personally worked with some Russia and Russia scholars. I think is totally, they have totally different perspective on this topic, and also in the politics and changes of the current movement. So I think some people may not be so welcoming to the USA, and maybe not so so against with the China in Taiwan. So as compared to the political direction and strategy we have in Taiwan, but there have been close strategic dispute over the Chinese Taipei rules. Okay, so I think it's very interesting to know that Taiwan-related issues have not been significantly part of the Chinese narrative in both the 2008 or 2022 Olympics. It's very interesting, and we have lots research on it. So another thing I want to mention is maybe is worth our attention is because I try to focus on the development of talent for international sport affairs. But in Taiwan's system, it's very interesting because unlike other type of diplomatic consular training, this kind of sports talents, they are trained by the Department of Sports Administration. So that means our government is not see them as a diplomatic players or important rules, but actually we have lots of training. So it's very interesting showing on the discourse and systems. So this illustrated the attempt to separate sport and politics in Taiwanese discourse. Okay, the government done that a lot. So even though it has always been entangled as one. So on the other hand, the last part, on the other hand, I'm thinking about the fact that the Olympic education itself, it is a already a very important part of sports education, right? So how can this complex situation affect the field and unite that provides the criteria of this value system for our introspection? Because what does the content, spirits, and requirement of Olympic education, so which were expected to be transmitted universally, right? What is mean today? So are they still accepted in different countries? And how can the various types of knowledge related to SME be transferred in different places? And this leads to a reflection on the necessity of Olympism and the possibility of its transformation. Yes, this is what I saw until now. So maybe we can have more discussion later. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sun. Well, we started 5 minutes later than we scheduled, so we still have some time. But David, maybe we can have Donggyu's comments first, and you can combine them together. Yeah.
Sounds good. Yeah.
Cool. Donggyu, please.
Okay. I
Sorry,
think
can I first introduce you to the audience?
it's okay. Yeah.
You know you.
Yeah, you know. Yeah.
Cool.
So, first, I would like to give my time to others to the floor more. So I'd like to. Is there anyone who have questions about David's presentation or something you wanted to add more? So I want to give my time to floor. So please, moderator, Dr. Professor Kim, so can you ask someone if there are some questions?
You can go ahead with the discussion.
Okay, so then I can make just a quick mention and have a question. So based on the previous historical background of Russia's way, like just right after, just before the 1980s Moscow Olympics and right after the 2014 Sochi Games, Russia and the back days, the Soviet invaded Afghanistan in 1979, just before the 1980s Moscow Olympics. And right after the Sochi Olympics, Russia also annexed the Crimea Peninsula forcefully. So I was wondering if something actions by Russia's are after or before the 2024 Paris Olympic or the pending 2022 Hangzhou Asian Games. So what do you think about that? This is my mentioning questions. Yeah.
Do you want me to try to answer? First of all, I want to thank Dr. Sun and Dr. Na for their questions. Really interesting food for thought. Dongkyu, in terms of your question about, if I get you correctly, the question is, can we expect Russia to do something else aggressive in the aftermath of these the Paris Olympic Games or the next Asian Games? I don't know what's left to do, frankly, at this point. I think that what will be interesting to see is what the status of the war in Ukraine is between now and the 2024 games, or sorry, yeah, the 2024 Paris Olympics. There is this question of whether Russia has used, and the Soviet Union has somehow used these events to provide a kind of distraction or cover for their aggressive designs. I find that, well, I suppose if we were being really cynical about this, we would say that what they wanted to show was that they that their geostrategic objectives didn't matter to the world. So, they hosted the Sochi Games, they invaded Crimea, and then they hosted the Paralympic Games. And apart from some objections and some political protests, there was very little. There were very few repercussions. There was very little price to be paid for their activities. And so in a certain sense, they were, I suppose, testing the waters to see what sort of reaction that there would be, that they could, and whether there would be a backlash internationally. And in many ways, this can be seen as enabling behavior in the sense that they really didn't anticipate the degree of backlash when it came to the full invasion of Ukraine, because at each step, when they had engaged in these provocations, there had been no real meaningful repercussions. And so in that sense, I do see international sports organizations like FIFA and like the International Paralympic Association as having engaged in enabling behavior. And it's not that it's not their fault, but really there was no meaningful action, and it raises a real core dilemma at the heart of Olympism, which is how you balance the degree to which the Olympics is supposed to be about human dignity and about peace, with the aspiration of the Olympic movement in particular to be universal. So not to exclude anybody, to enable all athletes to participate. And the Olympic movement really struggles with that ethical dilemma as well as the commercial dilemmas associated with it. So that's a very windy answer to your question. I don't think we're likely to see something after the Paris Olympic Games, because I don't think they really have the means at this point to engage in further aggression. But there is an interesting interweaving of Russia's what we might call revanchists, their desire to reestablish a Eurasian zone of influence, and the way that those intersected with their hosting of particular events. Of course, the Afghanistan invasion took place before the games and was the trigger for the boycott in 1980. So it's a different scenario. And what was really important in that case, it's often portrayed, especially in the sporting world, as a failure because Russia didn't pull out of Afghanistan. But to think that Russia would have pulled out of Afghanistan because of the Olympic boycott is pretty silly. But the fact that 40-some countries stayed away from the Olympic Games actually did matter quite a bit to the prestige of the event, and it really, as actually Jonathan Grix and Kramareva have said, it turned it into a second order event, and so it was a meaningful sanction in some ways. Dr. Sun, I really appreciate your comments. They're excellent. They covered a lot of territory. One of the things that Donkyu and I have talked about is this whole dynamic of the East Asian comparison, the East Asian norms of international sporting behavior and sport for development that have really interesting commonalities, but also, as you stress, some really important differences. And I think that there's a lot of important work in it, and you've pointed us towards some of it that needs to be done on the distinctiveness of the East Asian approach to the politics of international sport and sport for development. I guess I have written a little bit about this in the past in a piece on the East Asian development or Asian developmental states and sports mega events. And my argument there is that what we see is a kind of pattern of emulation, a sort of soft rivalry in which because the Japanese had succeeded so spectacularly in 1964, the Korean government wanted to do the same thing. The Beijing government felt that it needed to do the same thing. They do it in different ways, but with one common element, which is the way that they use this to signal hybridity. They signal, on the one hand, their success at modernizing and their achievements as modernizing states, but in ways that are blended with traditional norms and values. So it's a fascinating combination of using these events to reinscribe the distinctive features of their ancient histories and civilizations with their capacity to compete in the modern global economy and in the modern global society. So I find that fascinating, and I think there's a lot more to be done on that particular dynamic. The other point that I just wanted to pick up on, well, two other points. One is this issue of the way in which there's a lot of sympathy for Russia and a lot of sympathy for Beijing. And most governments didn't support a diplomatic boycott. It was actually a small minority of governments that did so. And I think that's a really important observation, because it's a signal of the degree to which what has been a Western-centered international order has much less popular appeal than it had a generation ago. We are seeing the erosion of Western centrality, which I think you mentioned is, in a sense, the Olympic movement and global sport in general has been centered on the Western world, and it's now being sharply contested. And the kind of sequence of events from 2018 to 2022 reflected that. So there's an East-West in a different sense, an Asia versus the West dynamic, which is important. But the other thing that I wanted to pick up on is your point about the way in which sport and politics have been separated in Taiwanese discourse. I think that is true of many countries. It's certainly true in the West. And to me, that's one of the things that makes sport such an important and peculiar political force, is precisely because it's supposed to be a space that's non-political. It offers a space for doing politics by stealth, if you like. For you can do things in this domain, you can signal things that would raise alarm bells if they were in the public domain. So it's that myth, the myth of autonomy, the myth that sport is not political, is one of the most politically potent elements of sport.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all. Well, I didn't see any questions waiting for me in the chat box, but from our audience, do we have any questions or comments for Professor Black, or even to discussants? Well,
can I ask the audience a question? Because I don't get to talk to an audience of Koreans very often. I'm interested in, from the outside, the Korea's hosting history in Seoul, and I'm saying Pyeongchang wrong. I'm sorry, I'm mispronouncing it. But and in the also in the FIFA World Cup, has been a story of success and achievement. And I wonder if it looks that way from Korea, because in Canada, we are often very critical of our sports mega event hosting experiences in ways that wouldn't be necessarily apparent on the outside. So I'm interested in whether most Koreans would see these as success stories for the Korean state.
Anyone from the audience? Is Pyeongchang Winter Olympics perceived in a positive fashion here or not? Well, maybe Jongkyu can answer this better.
Oh, okay. So, maybe Pyeongchang is actually I'm not much ready about David's questions. Can you clarify shortly?
Yeah, Dongkyu, my question is simply, does the degree to which the world sees Korea as having used these events in a very successful way, is as success stories for the Korean government and for Korean people, is that positive view shared within Korea itself? Is that clear?
I think, because in terms of soft power, so I think we use the effects of hosting Pyeongchang Games much getting longer rather than just because the Olympic is just a short term. So I think our government tried to use the effects more longer and longer, but I'm not sure compared to previous Seoul Olympics, the effects of hosting Pyeongchang Games a little bit shorter because it is related to kind of the changed factors of people's interest, how much interest people nowadays to Olympic Games, because nowadays Korean people have more things to enjoy rather than just the Olympic Games. Previous times, Seoul Olympic is the kind of one of the things Korean people much involved and engaged. But now, so Korean people not that much engaged because we have much things. So, but I think the Korean government tried to continue and then try to make the effects longer with using different events and different subsequent programs like sports for development programs to invite people from developing countries.
Well, if I can add a bit just from my experience, when Pyeongchang Winter Olympic was on, I was in Cape Town, I couldn't really watch anything because in Africa, we don't have winter, we don't have snow. I'm saying this because Winter Olympics is so political, it's white thing. So therefore, it was not just hosting another Olympic Games, it was Korea hosting what the rich country is doing. So in that, from the perspective of symbolic power, and finally we hosted it. So in that sense, it was still perceived in a positive manner. And also, it wasn't just Olympic per se or sport per se. Korea also invited athletes from the poor country, the countries which not have winter. And that sort of programs later became some form of development cooperation. And these sort of projects were also well propagated to the local audience. So in that sense, it was symbolic, and I think that's why it is still perceived pretty positive here.
I think that's a really interesting point. I think that the Winter Games, Summer Games comparison is fascinating because obviously the reach of the Winter Games is much smaller than the reach of the Summer Games in terms of the number of viewers and in terms of the number of participants, but its symbolic importance in terms of succeeding in the rich world's event, I think is a good point. I happened to have been during the Vancouver Winter Olympics in 2010. I was in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, and I have to tell you that Ethiopians didn't care at all about what was going on in Vancouver. So it was very hard for me to follow the events. But anyway, thanks. That's a great comment.
So if we can compare Winter Olympics and Summer Olympics, although most of those sports are elite sports, Summer Olympics, if I can put Summer Olympic as public goods, Winter Olympic is a club goods.
Right.
So exclusively for the members of the club.
Right. Very, very interesting point.
Well, by the way, we have a question from a student of Inha University. I think, David, you need to answer this. Well, let me just translate it to you. Wait. So this is from Park Ji-hyun. Hey, Park Ji-hyun, can we see your face? Was it too much? Yeah, Park Ji-hyun's, yeah, it's from her. If you don't want, hello, thank you for the question. Do you want to ask question yourself, or do you want me to do it for you?
Sure.
Yeah, please.
So first of all, I would like to thank Professor David for a great presentation lecture. It was so great to hear everything about mega sports, because I'm not really good at those kind of spectrum or area. So it was really interesting for me to understand what it really is, or like how it works. And I was wondering that as I know, the essence and the ideal of Olympics lie on Olympism and amateurism. So, however, I've been wondering whether utilizing the Olympics as a mega sports event for middle power or political purposes actually contradicts to the spirit and ideals of Olympism and amateurism. So I was kind of curious to know your thoughts on this kind of matter.
That's a great question. And in a sense, I think it connects to something that Dr. Sun was asking about as well, in terms of the ideals of Olympism. I think that this is a very fine line that the Olympic movement has walked for the last 30 years. Because on the one hand, one of the things that makes the event so attractive and so commercially successful is its association with the philosophy of Olympism and the high-minded values associated, the values of self-sacrifice, of human dignity, of equality. And in many ways, the event has come to contradict those values quite fundamentally, because it's so often associated with the generation of wealth and exclusion for people who have their houses, for example, bulldozed. And I think part of the crisis of the Olympic movement at the present time is the crisis of that contradiction. And so I think the Olympic movement has a real challenge on its hands of trying to reinvigorate, to renew the spirit of Olympism if it's going to save the games, frankly. One thing I will say about the Olympic movement is it has had a succession of near-death experiences over time. It has risen and fallen. It barely survived the 1936 Olympics and then the Second World War. And then it rose again. It barely survived the boycotts of 1976 and 80 and 84. And then it rose again. So it has this capacity for reinvention. But I think if they don't find a way to reground themselves in relation to those values, then they will be in a lot of trouble.
Thank you. Well, sport is fun, international politics is fun, and now we're talking about sport in international politics. How can it be not fun? So I understand we still have a lot more to talk about, but David, it's almost 11 p.m. there. I now think that this must be now perfect time to open a bottle for Friday night. Cool. So, well, Korea is an aspiring middle power country. Sport is very important, as David said, very important for soft power, and the Korean government indeed is making intentional effort to boost it. So I think more and more research and researchers are going to be needed. So we're going to have another opportunities to talk about this and get together. Finally, thank you, David, at this very night. It was really amusing. And thank you, Dr. Na. As
Excuse me, one question from floor. So if you have time, so just squeeze a little bit, to respond.
Sure, no problem.
who's that?
Park
Hanbit? Hanbit, can we see you? Park Hanbit is Hanbit student?
Sorry, yeah, it's me who was making question, but I don't think it's possible to present myself, but just can I make a question by audio?
Cool. Thank you.
Sure, yeah. I'm just reading it right now, Hanbit.
Yeah, it's so long, so sorry for making you read that, but my question is about the effectiveness of the cooperative efforts, when it comes to the bidding efforts, negatory event. Yeah,
I think that's a really great question. Of course, Korea and Japan pioneered co-hosting. I think, as I understand it, against their will, and with the FIFA World Cup, neither one really would have chosen to co-host the FIFA World Cup if they'd had a choice about it. But they showed that it could be a successful model. One of the key reforms the International Olympic Committee has proposed is the potential for multi-centered events and the potential for co-hosting. And of course, as you've said in your question, Hanbit, the 2026 FIFA World Cup is a co-hosted event between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. I have to say that the Canadian part in that, it's not really so much co-hosting as it is a hub and spoke arrangement, because Canada's portion is very small, but it's still something that creates more opportunities for more governments to participate in the benefits or the opportunities of Olympic hosting. So I actually think, and it also is in a sense more in the spirit of the Olympics as a cooperative and universal kind of undertaking. I think that these arrangements will always be fraught. This goes back to something that Dr. Sun said about the rivalries that exist between countries almost inevitably, and the resentments but as a kind of mechanism for developing habits of cooperation, I actually think this is a positive direction. And I think Canadians actually are kind of happy with this arrangement, because we get to be hosting participants, but we bear relatively limited costs and risks compared to what we would do if we were hosting on our own. And I actually think that there may be other countries that feel the same way.
Yeah, thank you for the response. But I was wondering about I was envisioning the possibility like Korea in the previous government was trying to make a bidding process with a collaboration with North Korea for 2032nd IOC Games, Olympic Games. So I just wanted to explore the possibility like when the opposite political positions can collaborate the bidding process for the mega sports games, even though it have never been realized or embodied before.
That's a really interesting. I hadn't picked up on the possibility of a joint bid in 2032. So that's a really interesting example. Of course, this is a major theme in the Pyeongchang Games in 2018, is that the ways in which it got associated with diplomatic rapprochement, diplomatic overtures, and the kind of the symbolic, joint team and the hockey team that was a combined team. it's hard for me to imagine that being a viable option in the foreseeable future, given the mistrust that exists and given the very different levels of capacity that exist between North and South Korea. I say that as someone who has, as I said at the beginning, is not a Korea expert, but I think at this stage, we're still at the stage where hosting will require a relatively high degree of compatibility in terms of political and economic systems in order to make this work. So as inspiring as that idea is, I don't see it as plausible for the foreseeable future. But it is interesting because probably some of the most symbolically important overtures between North and South Korea have taken place in the domain of sport, I would say, at least from my limited understanding. So I think that we may see a step-by-step process in which smaller initiatives take place that can be built upon over time. But I don't see a co-hosted games in the near future.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. Now, no more questions. Okay, thank you all. Thank you very much. Thank you, David. Thank you, Dongyu, and thank you, chatting. And I thank the sponsoring and hosting organizations as well. And thank you all for participating in this fantastic colloquium. This is it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity.
We enjoyed your talk. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye, thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Night.
Night.
Good night.
이제 저도 나갈게요.
네,
수고하셨습니다.
수고하셨습니다.